Hey everyone, this is Jen. I am recording this lecture because actually a few people missed the lecture on Thursday, and rather than teaching 5 or 6 people the notes of what was going on, I figure I'll just do this and you can press play and pause and do what you need to do. So the lecture on Thursday was about the president's traditions in history. You know that the Constitution only states that what the certain duties of the president is, but obviously the president does a lot more now, and those duties have increased through tradition. And what the professor was talking about on Thursday, he went through certain presidents, not all of them, so you'll only need to know the ones that we mention here on the PowerPoint notes. What they did to contribute to that tradition. I'll mention what he mentioned. The thing is that on class, we went into the news a lot, so he was kind of rushed to go through this lecture. So I would suggest that you just, with these presidents that I mentioned, go to the Wikipedia page, look into briefly their foreign policy, domestic policy, and any other little thing like that, and know that. Don't fret on the other presidents that we didn't cover, because since he didn't cover them in lecture and the book doesn't really cover it, he probably won't be testing on it. So let's go on ahead. The first president that we covered, we'll be covering these, I believe, in the actual order that they went, was George Washington, and as it says on the first point, he was the first president that we had. The thing about George Washington was, if you recall from our lecture back on Tuesday, he was very Taftian in his approach. What we'd said by this, what Taftian was, is very minimalist. The reason why was because he was watched carefully. He was the first president. Everyone was looking towards him to see what he was doing, and he really didn't want to contradict the Constitution too much. He didn't want to set, a bad standard. He had to be very, very cautious with everything he did. So that's why he didn't really do too much. He did a lot beforehand and everything, but during his term as president, he was on his toes. That's basically what we covered on him. The next president that we covered was Thomas Jefferson, and like Washington, a lot of people were watching him, but for a different reason. A lot of the people feared Jefferson because of his intellect. He was the one that basically, he wrote the Declaration of Independence, and as we learned earlier in the semester, he wrote that opening paragraph to the Constitution too. This was obviously a very smart and powerful man, and people were intimidated by him. And you'll see on that little subnote right there where it says that he did not read the State of the Union address because he knew that the people were a little intimidated by him. He actually had an office hand read off his State of the Union address because he wanted to be kind of viewed equal with the people. He didn't want to be this high above thing because people may have been afraid that he might have tried to go in a different direction than they were hoping that the new country would want to be in. Another point that we made in class was that he was the first person to make his inaugural address, and the professor made a point of pointing out that he had faced east, and since then the other presidents that make the inaugural address would always face east until we get to Reagan, but I'll cover that later on. So just you may want to remember that. I don't know if that'll come up, but the professor did mention that. The other thing was that Jefferson was a big supporter of state rights. Our professor was saying that he did believe in heavily the separation of the states and what they want to do, but he did actually go out of his way to put Federalists in middle positions, not like the big high-ranking, not in the low-ranking positions, but in the middle positions, to show that even though he was a supporter of the states' rights and not the whole federalism, he was willing to work with it. He was willing to work with the other side. The other point that we had made in class was that he was very conscious of the debt that was going on even back then. What he did with the different things like the Lewis and Clark expeditions, he funded libraries and a lot of other bills and stuff. He would he would support those with his own money. He did not like dipping into the nation's coffers too much, and he actually, we were talking about this in class, when it came to the Lewis and Clark expedition, he originally sent someone over to talk about the Louisiana Purchase, about a sum of just like $1 million, and when that person came back, it was suddenly way more than that. But he actually, well, I'm not sure all of it, and that's why I said you need to read into it, because this isn't in our book. This is what we just talked about in class. You might want to read more into it, but he tried to support a lot of these programs and things that he funded with his own money rather than creating a bigger debt. Then we skip ahead to Abraham Lincoln. Remember, the professor did not cover every single president. We're only going to talk about, well, at this point of the lecture, about the important ones. Then we start to get a little closer in with the other ones, but you'll see. Abraham Lincoln, we really did not talk about him too much. What we did talk about was that he did take extraordinary steps to save the Union, meaning that he did a huge stretch in power. Technically, it is Congress that has the right to declare war, as we have already learned. But because the Union was falling apart, and you had your radical Republicans that wouldn't support war unless it fit their cause, and then the other Republicans that would have wanted war, because Congress wasn't agreeing on it, he just said, sit down, shut up, this is what we're doing. He really stretched the power, and that's set in motion with what we see today, where in a time of war, the president can take certain rights, where he can do certain actions if he sees fit to. And nowhere in the Constitution does it say that he can do that, but Abraham Lincoln was the one that set this in motion. The professor, as I said, did not talk about Abraham Lincoln too much, because the thing is that, yes, he did his full first term, but during that, we were going through the Civil War. I mean, he was really consumed with that. And when he got elected for his second term, he really didn't spend much time in it, because he was assassinated right after that. So we don't know what else Abraham Lincoln would have done. He had a whole reconstruction plan of what to do with the freed slaves and how to rebuild America, but he was assassinated after that, and we'll never know what his plan was, and that's why we didn't talk about him too much in class. Then we skip ahead to Theodore Roosevelt. And Roosevelt first came in when President McKinley died, and then he came in as president. And sorry, looking over my notes. Roosevelt was very pro-expansionism and an avid user of power, and I probably should have written those together because they kind of go hand in hand. Roosevelt was very gung-ho about us going into the Spanish War. There was a time during that where a lot of people, they were afraid of expansionism. They thought that it should maybe only stay within America, the expansionism westward. But a lot of people were thinking, well, everyone else is expanding their empires. You know, the British are making their colonies in Africa and all over the Pacific Islands, and other countries are too. We need to follow in suit and make ourselves an empire, because otherwise America will not stand up to par with the others. And Roosevelt was one of these people. He was an avid believer in that unless we established these other ports and we made our presence known, America would never become a great power. And that's why he was so pro with the Spanish War. And we just mentioned it briefly, and I suggest you do go on to read about it and read about Roosevelt, the Rough Riders, and what he calls a dandy little war, but it wasn't really. But he was, I mean, everybody knows Roosevelt was a cowboy, and I suggest you read into why that is. That might help you during the midterm, but we'll see during when we review for the midterm. If he mentions this too much, I can go back into depth on all of this again, but that's why I suggest you just read independently on the Wikipedia theme, because the professor was kind of rushed and didn't go into a lot of this very in depth. So he was big into making us an empire. Before Roosevelt, we had established the Anti-Sherman Trust Act to try and prevent monopolies. And even though this was established about, I'm making a guess here, I think about 2 presidents before him, it hadn't been imposed too much because we were practicing laissez-faire, which is the government is hands-off on business, and we were actually kind of supporting these monopolies and things like that because it kind of helped out the government too. Roosevelt was really into the trust busting, the breaking up the railroad companies and things like that to help get the smaller businesses in there. I mean, Roosevelt and trust busting, that almost goes hand in hand, just like Roosevelt and Rough Riders. The other thing that we mentioned in class, which was an interesting point, was that Roosevelt also won a Nobel Peace Prize for mediating. He mediated other things too, but in specific, this Peace Prize was about mediating, making negotiations during a Japanese war at the time. You remember there were other countries trying to colonize, and he had mediated something over there, but the professor did not go too far into that. Let me see. So that's about it that we had for Theodore Roosevelt. And the professor, this is just a side story thing, he mentioned the whole story of how Theodore Roosevelt got in the name Teddy and why teddy bears are called that, and I'm sure you guys all knew that too. If you don't, you should look that up. It's a fun little story. The president after that, not right after that, obviously, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, just FDR. And the first thing you should know is that he did serve 4 terms. No other president has served this amount of time. And actually, we had to pass a law that says that a president shall only serve 2 terms because Roosevelt was just getting reelected and reelected and reelected, and it was getting a little out of hand there. So when FDR came in, remember I mentioned laissez-faire, the government was practicing hands-off on businesses. Businesses were kind of free to go off and do their own thing willy-nilly. There was a lot of violations against the workers, against other companies, and the consumer, and it was getting to the point where he'd realized that the laissez-faire was starting to, the government not getting into this, it was starting to lead to poverty. We were in the Great Depression because since Reconstruction, since the Civil War, things had not been good in America. And even though it would from time to time get better, it progressively would get worse and worse. And even in the Industrial Revolution around Theodore Roosevelt and a bit before him, it was becoming awful. And by this point here, things were just terrible. We were in our Great Depression. So he'd come up with the New Deal, and I put deals with the parentheses around that because the professor wanted us to know that there was more than just one New Deal. There were actually about 4. The first New Deal, it was interesting because he just wrote it up and he said, here's the New Deal. To the Congress, he said, here's the New Deal. This is how it's going to be. boom, and they said, no, get out, because as we all know, that is not how a bill is passed, and they actually had to rewrite it a few more times to get it in motion. The general gist of the New Deal, what we talked about in class, is that because we were in our depression, Roosevelt figured if we had borrowed money, you know how we've already borrowed money from China, if we borrow money, we can use that borrowed money to create jobs, and with those jobs we created, we can tax the people with those jobs to pay off the debt. And if this sounds a little bit familiar, it's because we also talked about it in class with the Obama's jobs bill. When we were talking in class, we actually talked about that because that same day in the morning, Obama was talking about pass this jobs bill, pass it, and then by the time we had gotten in class, it looked like since that day, that same day, things were not going good in the world of the jobs bill, and it's probably changed since then. You might want to research on that because he'll probably ask us. But yeah, that was basically what the general gist of the New Deal was supposed to be, was to try and fix the economy by borrowing money and then using this borrowed money when we fix the economy to create the new jobs, get the money moving, and pay off the debt with what we taxed on that. Roosevelt also aided in the development of our military because he was into the whole mass production. Mass produce these guns, mass produce these planes, and so it really built up the military as far as the funding goes and everything. And I write desired peace as that other subnote because it's important to know the difference in what I'm saying here next. Our professor used these words to describe it, that Roosevelt was the architect of the UN's desire for peace. Now don't misconfuse this as him being the founder for the UN, because he wasn't. That was Woodrow Wilson working on it. What we mean by the architect was that he had thought up an idea that we as many nations needed to cooperate together, and by us cooperating together, we would be able to get the peace. So he didn't quite set up the UN, but he had a slight vision for that. And the professor mentioned that, and I figured that was something worth mentioning, saying, because anything little in a lecture could be a big deal later. It's important to know these little things. On Truman, as you see, from this point on, we should be hopefully, I think, going president to president to president now. The reason why is because now we're starting to get a little more recent, and not to be biased here, but we care a little bit more about the recent presidents because that affects us a little bit more than the older presidents, because a lot of things have changed since Washington's time or Jefferson's time. So that's why we're now going to just start going through them bit by bit. And on pictures like these, that doesn't mean that these presidents aren't important. That just meant that as far as what the professor said, he didn't mention too much, and so I couldn't really write much, but I at least dedicated a slide to them because I own that much. So with Truman established the economy after World War II. You remember FDR had set up the New Deal to get us out of the Great Depression. Well, we had just gotten out of the World War II, and the bombs on Hiroshima and everything like that. And as you guys may already know, war is not cheap. That's why our economy is doing so bad. War costs money. You don't just get the money from nowhere. You don't get the tanks from nowhere. And he helped establish our economy after that war. But you're going to start noticing a downfall here after this. So that's all we mentioned about Truman, was just he established the economy after World War II. Eisenhower, or as I just call him Ike, because that's all I've heard as the I Like Ike campaign, so I just call him Ike. Dwight Eisenhower, though, was very pro-economic expansion. What that kind of means is that not just in the domestic sense, but in the foreign relations sense too. Just trying to get the economy moving and grooving. He also claimed the right of involvement if it suits our interests. And that's big, because normally we would... Sorry, I got distracted by something. So, right of involvement, I'm sorry. Normally, when we would want to investigate something going on with other countries and foreign relations, need a little bit of probable cause. And he kind of dumbed down the sense of probable cause of, well, it suits our interests, so we're going to go because we need to go. It's kind of like that crappy way of not giving an excuse, but giving an excuse at the same time. And this definitely plays further and today in our current politics. And the professor did make a point of mentioning that he was the one that started that. He also made something which kind of made me giggle a little bit in class about this. He made a big warning about, let me pull out my notes here. He warned about lobbyists, the politicians, and the defense establishment mingling unwatched. He was basically, what he said was that if the lobbyists and the politicians and the defense establishment continue mingling unwatched, it will basically be very bad and could ruin our country. And if you do look at that by today's standards, yes, that's what's going on with our Wall Street's protests and everything like that, is that with them mingling, a lot of people have been left out in the dark because it's been going unwatched, and he warned about that. So the professor basically just wanted to mention that. Why is my thing not going? Oh, I clicked out, sorry. John F. Kennedy, and I know that some of you are going to say the professor should have talked about him way more than he did, but he didn't because, well, you'll see. What he did say about Kennedy is that he was our first modern day president, and by saying that was that the first one that was like on TV that you could see in, you could see the others in pictures or in like photographs, but he was on TV, on the news, like a little more high profile than the other ones were. And that's all he mentioned about Kennedy. And when you guys do decide to go off on your own and read about more on your own, you'll see there was a lot more going on with Kennedy. But as far as what it did to set the tradition of the responsibilities of other presidents, that's what we're talking about, is that there wasn't too much going on there that set the pace for others. He did more for the other people. He did do a lot of great stuff, but we're just not talking about that. Lyndon B. Johnson, however, we will talk about, which was the man that did take over. And he expanded a bit on the New Deal. I'm sorry I did not make that point. I was supposed to write a little bullet about that, and I failed you on that. I'm sorry. You remember the New Deal with FDR? Well, the New Deal was a lot simpler than what you guys might know what it is now, because Lyndon B. Johnson expanded on that. He tried to take it a step further to try and help the economy out a little more, because the one that did get approved by FDR was a little bit simpler. Now, the bullet that I did make ties into this. He believed in a great society, and what this means is the spending on domestic services. Well, that's what he did by elaborating a little bit more on the New Deal. This is the reason why we have certain services available to us that we do now. Domestic services, what I'm talking about your medical care, your social security, your retirement, and things like that. Now, I'm not an expert on the New Deal. I don't know what was set up during FDR's time and what was set up on Lyndon B. Johnson's time, and even the professor he may have been more clear on that. He wasn't too specific on that because by this time we were starting to run out of time in class and he was talking a lot faster. So I would really suggest that maybe you look on the differences on those and just know that he did expand on it. Back to my notes. He also, I wrote Vietnam there because do you remember when we were talking about with Dwight Eisenhower, the right of involvement if it suits your interests? And we had been involved a little bit because of the communism, Vietnam, and everything else that was going on. And he lied a little bit. You remember we were talking a few weeks ago about how he had sent those boats. There was that along the coast of Vietnam. There was this whole thing where we were not supposed to come so close to the coast or else they would become very cross with us. And so what Johnson did was he had our boats inch closer and closer until they were fired upon, and then he lied and said, look what they did! They fired upon us! It's terrible! We must go to war! Now, remember, Congress has the right to declare war. Congress did not want to declare war, so he used this, the right of interest. You know, they bombed us. They blew up our ships, and by lying about what actually happened, it suited our interests. And then he did something similar to what George Bush did, where he did not. It's not a official war. But he did his own thing where it was funded and then he has to go back. And you remember us talking about it. The professors mentioned it a few times. And I, again, suggest you guys go on with this and read a little bit more. But that was what happened with the Vietnam War. It was just that going on where Eisenhower left off and using a little lie to start a war. And then the civil rights. I know a lot of people say Kennedy was the civil rights. Kennedy was the civil rights. Well, Kennedy was during the civil rights, but when we're talking about closer to the end, it was mainly Johnson there that we're talking about because well, according to our professor, remember, we're going off of what our professor said because the book didn't go too far into it. Johnson cracked down on rights in the South. Remember, we have these Jim Crow laws going on, and the poll taxes and things like that to try and disenfranchise. When I say that, I'm talking about removing the right to vote. So disenfranchise the blacks in the South, and in other parts in America too. And that's where you start to see the crackdown on rights. I'm not too clear if that's when we're starting to see the integration. You might want to look into that, but you're probably looking at that too. So just remember, as far as the professor's concerned, you should connect rights to Johnson and Kennedy, just modern day president. Sorry, Kennedy. So moving on to our next president, we've got Richard Nixon. Oh, look at him. Doesn't he look all nice? So Nixon expands on our war in Asia. When we were with Johnson, remember, it was just with Vietnam. But with Nixon, now we're in Korea, and now we're in other parts in Asia. So that expanded on our war because we've got the Korean War, the Vietnam War. There's the whole just... How did they... Because, I'm born in the 80s. I wasn't from that time. So it's just the communists, because we're not just talking about the Soviet Union, we're talking about China, we're talking about Korea and Vietnam War. And for those of you that aren't too clear about it, what we're talking about is that both Korea and Vietnam, because it's kind of split up almost similarly, we have people in the northern part of Vietnam, northern part of Korea, that are talking more to the Chinese and the Russians. They're more interested in going to communism, and we're like, no, communism's bad. You need to go to capitalism. You need to do democracy. That's what's good. And it started a whole war about that. And this, with Nixon, we see the expansion of this Cold War, I guess you could say. He did, however, open the door with Russian negotiations. So sitting down and talking to the Russian, well, that time I guess you would say Soviet Union, the Soviet Union people, and making the negotiations, because with the Cold War, I forget if the professor mentioned this or if was in one of my other classes, but the Cold War was, even though it was us against Russia, we never actually fought each other. We had other people fight them for us, and they had other people fight us for them. So that's why you get the word Cold Wars, because it was never like a head-to-head like thing. But he did open up the door for these Russian negotiations to try and put a stop to this.
Also, Russia's cold.
What? Russia's cold? Sorry about that. I'm sorry. So anyways, I got distracted. Watergate. You knew we would have to talk about this eventually. We really did not go too far into this because, as I said, we were running out of time. The general gist of the Watergate thing was that Nixon had broken into the Watergate Hotel to try and get a hold of some paperwork. And he got caught. And, that's a huge violation of what it is to be a president. Remember, you can be impeached under bribery, which he had been caught doing, under treason, high crimes, and misdemeanors. And breaking into a hotel, well, it may not be a high crime, but it's certainly a misdemeanor. It's naughty. So he did get impeached, and as we've learned in class, impeach does not equal removal from office. Impeachment is just the process of finding if they have committed these acts that would possibly remove them from office. It did get down to, if you go back to our previous lectures, we were going over the impeachment process, how it goes with the House of Representatives and the Senate and everything else. And when it gets to that point where they look at the case, and if they view him as violating these terms, basically to actually be tried, because remember, it's the Supreme Court that actually files the official charges and will remove him from office and charge him and punish him with anything else. The Congress just looks over the general stuff and says, yes, he has done these high crimes, and he for impeachment, and he did get to that point, but then he resigned, so he was technically never removed from office. We've already talked about this a million times. I'm sorry that I went into it. I got carried away. So I just remember that, because I'm sure it would irritate the professor very much if someone says he was impeached from office. Please do not write that. Please do not make him angry. I don't like angry classes. So that's just all that we talked about with Nixon. Gerald Ford! He's happy. I love these other pictures. I'm sorry. Not much to talk about with him. Our economy's starting to tank. We've got the Cold War, and even though the Cold War is still, as I've said, a Cold War where we're not fighting head on, a war is a war, and a war needs funding, and the funding has to come from somewhere, and it hurts the economy. And during Ford's time, you've just got unhappy people and an unhappy economy. That's all we said about that. Carter. Well, all I knew about Carter was that he lusted in his heart for peanuts. But apparently there's more than that. Apparently, all we mentioned about with Carter was that he reversed the progress with Russia. Now, remember back with Nixon, I was talking about opening the door for negotiation with the Russians, talking with them and getting the whole peace thing. Well, Carter kind of messed some things up. Now, that's all we talked about in class. Remember, you want to read a little bit more on that. I've been talking about this. I want to remind you guys again. The key points you want to look into with these presidents I've been mentioning are their domestic policies, their foreign policies, and you just look at the general health of the economy at the time. As long as you know that, like a general thing, you should be okay. Ronald Reagan. Mr. Reagan. Oh, remember back with Jefferson, way back ago in the beginning of this lecture, I was talking about Jefferson's inaugurational speech, how he was facing the east. Well, Reagan did his facing west, and the professor was asking people, do you know why? And they were saying, well, he faced it west as in, chase the sun, go and do it and be it and all that other 80s crap that I was too young to even want to be a part of. So that was the inaugurational speech. He was into the restoration of our prestige. America was not looking good. It doesn't look good when you go to a non-sanctioned war and kill a bunch of people. At this time, a lot of stuff had come out as far as media, because remember, we've got TV now, and we can see things during the Vietnam War that we couldn't see during World War II. That's why Vietnam War is so negatively viewed. We could see all the citizens that we killed over there, and we could hear all the war crimes that we had committed over there. So he was really into the whole restoration of our prestige, trying to make America sound a little bit better than we had been making ourselves out to be. But regrettably, prestige isn't much when you're deep in debt. We, by that time, were pretty deep in debt. It gets worse. His foreign policy, all that we mentioned was that it was bad foreign policy. It wasn't even no foreign policy, it was just bad foreign policy. Going back to that restoration of prestige, though, that means that it wasn't that great of a combination, but even though the foreign policy was bad, we had some decent domestic policy. But by this time in class, we were really rushed for time. Did not go that much into it. Bush, by this time, the economy is tanked. We are way in debt, and we had mentioned the fall of the Soviet Union, fall of the Berlin Wall, things like that. So you got some happy times, but you still got some really bad debt. With Clinton, we see the economy healed. Now, do you remember that chart that we did on the second or third day of class? It was that graph that the professor made where he drew our debt going up. Well, that's similar to how the debt was back then with the Bush administration. Let me go back. That's how the debt was back with the Bush administration, just up. But with the Clinton administration, not only does it go down, and we are no longer in debt, now we're in a surplus. So the economy is healed. Everything is great. Regrettably, though, there is no foreign policy. We're hands off because we're so consumed with our domestic policy, what's going on here in America, and his trial, which I'll talk about later. So there was no foreign policy. Now, during the Cold War, you may have heard about this. There was the whole dealing with the Middle East during the Cold War. But when the Soviet Union falls, and over in Iraq and Afghanistan and everything like that, those people were just left like nowhere, like, hey, what's going on? America and the Soviet Union with all of your promises, and there was no foreign policy, so we're kind of starting to sit on our ticking time bomb here. But we'll worry about that later. Right now we're going to talk about the trial. The professor really did not want to talk about this because we all know how it's been we all know what's been said. We all know how it's been sensationalized, but basically you need to know what he was charged with: the whole obstruction of justice and perjury and having a little too much fun with his interns. And that's it. And also, back with Nixon, you remember the whole impeachment? Do not say Bill Clinton was impeached from office. He underwent in the impeachment process, but he was never removed from office. So don't word it where it would sound like he was removed from office. So don't say that sentence. Do not say he was impeached from office. It's a bad sentence, because technically that did not happen. Ever. So the last president we talk about is Bush, and by this time the professor was flustered and aggravated and out of time. And all we mentioned was just those words that I wrote there. That was all that was said. The largest expansion of power, because remember with Eisenhower, if it suits our interests, we have the right to be involved. And after 9/11, the Middle East suddenly suited our interests. We were sitting on that ticking time bomb where over in the Middle East they're like, America, where did you go? And now they're angry at us. And then 9/11 happened right after Bush came into office. And so we had a large expansion of power because this was in our interest. Now we were suddenly all over the Middle East. But there was also the largest violations. And we're not just talking about the human rights violations. We're talking about constitutional violations, because the president does not declare war, Congress declares war. And there were a lot of things that he was not supposed to do that Congress was supposed to do, and he went ahead and did that. The Patriot Act, I'm sure would be thrilled if you knew about that, and the professor would be thrilled if you knew about that, and everything like that. So that's it. That's all that we mentioned as far as our lecture went. As I said, this all got jammed in pretty tightly, and sorry, I got distracted. This all got jammed in pretty tightly in a time frame of about 30 minutes because we were talking about the news so much. We were talking about the Jobs bill and that man in Portugal that got extradited and everything like that. That took up a ton of class time, and talking about the Wall Street protests. So that's why I would suggest, even I'm going to probably go on Wikipedia or something and look into each of these foreign and domestic policies and the general health of the economy. I cannot stress that enough. That's what you would want to know. And remember, this isn't a history class, this is a political science class. You don't need to know the date that President Bush came into office was this time, and at this date and this time he declared that we will go over to Afghanistan. You don't need to know that. You just need to know that that's what happened. So the general points that I would advise into looking into more are the New Deal, knowing the process that FDR went through, because remember, he tried to go around Congress to get that New Deal in, and that's not how a bill is passed. Eisenhower's idea of that we claim the right of involvement if it suits our interests, and how Johnson expanded on that and Bush expanded on that. The declining economy, and what's more important to know rather than the declining economy is what was going on around that. You don't just have a bad economy. The economy was bad because of a war. The economy was bad because of the monopolies back during trust busting when I mentioned with Theodore Roosevelt. So if you kind of just know what was going on around those bad economies and just what led to what, you should be okay. And I hope you got enough from this lecture. Oh, also, by the way, as I've said, you Don't need to know any of the other presidents that I did not mention, because these were the key ones that we mentioned in class. You should be fine with this. Alright, good luck, and if you see me in class, feel free to ask me questions.